IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It's Thursday of Notre Dame's second bye week, which means we are going to kind of have a bit of a relaxing weekend, Trevor. That's Trevor Trowbridge. I'm Brian Driscoll. No stress about what's Notre Dame going to do. There are some things going on this weekend that could impact Notre Dame, and we'll talk about that in part 3 of today's show. But, Trevor, we've talked, you and I have talked a lot, not just on the show, but just just privately in some of our conversations, is that this Notre Dame football team is obviously playing really good football, and it's got to continue, right? They've got to keep playing good football, and can they play good football? But the interesting thing about this team that I don't know has been true a lot of years is usually by the time you get to game 9, you kind of are who you are, especially when game 9 comes in. It'll be the 11th week of the college football season, right? Because Notre Dame will have had 2 byes. You kind of are who you are. But this Notre Dame team is a bit of a unique situation, Trevor, because of just their overall youth as a team, because of how much lineup chain turnover there has been, with guys getting injured and going out on both sides of the ball. And you look at this Notre Dame football team, and unlike most years where, like I said, by the time you get to game 9, week 11, you are who you are for the most part, this team actually has a chance, in my opinion, to still kind of keep getting better. And I don't know how much better. I don't know if it's incremental growth. I don't know if there's another big jump coming. I don't know the answer to that, Trevor, but I do believe this team has an opportunity to get better. In ways that normally you don't see this time of year. Like growth this time of year can happen like, hey, we're still not a great third down offense. We can shore that up during the bye week. Or, hey, we still got to make some adjustments in the run game. And we'll talk about some of that stuff. But before we dive into that, Trevor, we'll get into the fact that just overall as a team, why this team has a chance to get better. We'll dive into the offense and areas that we want to see improvement from that side of the ball. We'll do the same thing for defense. And then we're also going to have a fun conversation about what are the 3 players on each side of the ball that we think hold the keys to this team really playing its best football in the Final 4 games, because it's a stretch of games where Notre Dame can go 4-0, but it's not going to – and they could go 4-0 and win convincingly like they have been, which we talked about yesterday in the Bice Whole. But there's also multiple teams on the schedule that if Notre Dame sort of reverts back to some previous levels of play from past parts of the season, there's at least, 3 teams that I think could knock Notre Dame off, in my opinion. So we'll get into that as well, Trevor. But before we begin, let's say a little word about a new friend of the show that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked a lot about how exciting the month of November is going to be for college football and football in general. And one thing that you guys should all go and check out is a sports book called MyBookie. So this Saturday, there is a bunch of different slated games. You have Ohio State taking on Penn State. You have Texas A&M traveling down to South Carolina. You have Oregon taking on Michigan, Ole Miss. They're going to be battling on Saturday as well, which I know we're
SMU Pitt, baby. SMU Pitt. That's going to be a big one.
SMU Pitt. If you're anything like me, you're going to be throwing down some bets this weekend. I definitely plan on doing that. Right now, Ohio State sitting as 3.5-point favorites. Oregon sitting at a 14.5-point favorite, and Ole Miss is a 7-point favorite in their matchups this weekend. Take a look at MyBookie to throw down some bets on what those betting odds are going to be. And we've been talking about it all week. It's Thursday, which is risk-free Thursday for MyBookie. So definitely check out what those odds are going to be for that Thursday night game tonight. I believe the Jets are taking on the Texans. So that's something that you should definitely check out in the MyBookie risk-free Thursdays. You can also enroll in their loyalty program to earn extra cash for just throwing down some bets and doing what you do. But MyBookie is that sports book that gives you control and rewards you for every moment of play.
So, Trevor, you talked about the big games this weekend. There's certainly some games that are going to impact Notre Dame's resume. But at the end of the day, the biggest boost to Notre Dame's resume is going to be what Notre Dame does. I mean, that's the thing. It's going to be what they do. And as we dive into this breakdown, Trevor, you kick it off. The reality is this team, if they just maintain the level of play we've seen the last 4 games, this team will go 4-0. But the question for you Trevor, that I have for you is, will that be good? I don't believe that's necessarily good enough to make a deep run into the postseason. It'll be good enough to get them there, but I don't know if it's going to be a good enough run to get them all the way. I believe for this team to truly peak late in the season and then be in a position where they can kind of say, hey, we're not afraid of anybody. Bring it on. We're going to take on anybody. I do believe that this team needs to shore up a few areas where they're not quite as good as they need to be. Even maybe they're good, but they need to be better, or areas where they're not as good, that they certainly need to step things up a bit.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you brought up that Notre Dame's at a weird impasse right now. Is typically when a team has already played 8 games, you have an idea for what this team is going to be about. And the Notre Dame coaching staff is going to be tasked with a really interesting next 4 weeks of games, essentially after the bye. I think it is fair to say that if Notre Dame just played every single opponent, if they played Florida State and Virginia and Army and USC like they did against Navy, I think we're looking at an 11-1 Notre Dame team. But then the question becomes, what's that going to look like if you're a 7 seed in the playoffs? What's that going to look like if you get to the second round of the playoffs and eventually make it to the semifinals, right? Because that level of play needs to be elevated. So I think just as much it is going to be on the players that we're going to discuss today and who on the field kind of has that key to Notre Dame taking that next step, it's going to be just as much about the coaching. Because, Brian, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, in years previous, we've seen Notre Dame teams that are just kind of like, well, I mean, it's good enough to win out and do what we need to do. And then you get into the postseason and you play just that upper tier of opponents where Notre Dame just hasn't been able to get over that hump in those big New Year's Six games that we talked about yesterday in the buy, sell, hold. So as much as it's going to be on the players, the coaches are going to have to take that next step and kind of kick it into high gear over these next 4 games, because not only do you have to win and win convincingly, there are steps that you have to take if you want to make a deep run in the playoffs this year as well.
I don't know that any of the teams that they play down the stretch, Trevor, necessarily prepare them for what's to come in the next round, like the playoff, right? And that was a question that we had got asked yesterday. Does playing USC prepare you for? And I'm like, nah, I mean, sort of. You and I were talking. I mean, skill wise, yeah, USC is gonna give you. I mean, their secondary's got some talent in it. Their receivers have talent. So in that regard, to a degree, yeah. Maybe I'm hoping that actually USC's hot by then and can really play to their potential. I think that's actually good for Notre Dame. Not only does it get Notre Dame a much better looking win, but I think USC playing at their best, if Notre Dame can win that game, will give Notre Dame a test to prepare for the postseason. But as of right now, they got to play better. So it's not so much about, okay, this opponent's going to prep you. Like Army, it could be a great ranked win, a resume win. There's nothing you're going to get out of that schematically or talent-wise that's going to prepare you to go play Georgia or Texas or Alabama or Ohio State or Oregon, right? I mean, so really what it comes down to is it's about Notre Dame. And Marcus Freeman has talked a lot about this. It's like, look, and it's a comment he made where he actually caught a lot of flack, and I don't think he should have. They asked him about what his expectations are, and the comment he made was, our expectations are to be the best team we can be, essentially. I'm paraphrasing. And he said, it's not about points. It's not about stats. It's not about wins and losses. It's about being the best we can be. And I know there were some people that didn't like that comment because they're like, no, it's to go undefeated. And it's like, no, you're missing the point. The point is if Notre Dame plays to their full potential, they can beat anybody. And so to beat anybody, to win all your games, to win a championship, you need to get to be the best version of yourself. And this is the thing that we missed so long in the Brian Kelly era. And then a lot of coaches miss is hey, he won 10 plus games X number of years in a row. So how many of those teams did he maximize the potential of that football team? Does anybody believe that the 2015 team was maximized to its fullest potential? I don't. I don't think the 2018 team was. I know for a fact the 2019 and 2021 teams were. I'll give them a pass for 2020 because of the craziness of COVID that no one can control. But you look at it and you say, well, Marcus Freeman's got to learn to do the same thing. He hasn't maximized the potential of his team so far. I think looking back on 2022, you could say record-wise, maybe he maximized the potential of that team because they did win some games maybe they shouldn't have with consider who they had a quarterback for a big chunk of that season. But that team didn't maximize its potential. Last year's team certainly didn't maximize its potential. This team hasn't when you look at the entirety of it, but that's the whole point, though. Moving forward, it's about getting there. right? Ohio State didn't look like a championship team in September when Virginia Tech was kicking their butt, at home back in 2014. Clemson didn't look like a national championship team in November when Pitt came to Clemson and beat them. They didn't look like a playoff caliber team when they went on the road and lost to a 4-8 Syracuse team in 2017. Clemson didn't look like a championship caliber team in 2018 when they needed Chase Bryce to come off the bench and pull off a comeback win over Syracuse. Right. And so you have those games, Trevor, where it's like, yeah, you didn't play to your full potential. And sometimes you catch an L, sometimes you don't. But where are you when you get to the postseason? When I think back to that 2018 Clemson team, and that team has a lot of parallels between this Notre Dame team. And it's a different talent base. I'm not comparing, well, Notre Dame was good here, they were good here. I'm not saying that Notre Dame's receivers are as good as the Clemson receivers were in 2018. That's not the point that I'm making. The point that the comparison I'm making is more so when you look at that Clemson team, they had some really good veteran players on that team, but they had a lot of young players on that team, a lot of young players, freshmen and sophomores playing. And you look at earlier in the season, and they'd have their moments where they looked great, right? I mean, blew out, Georgia Tech and Wake Forest and NC State and Florida State and Louisville. And then they had, but early in the season, they barely beat an okay Texas A&M team on the road. They struggled to beat that team. That was a decent 9-win Texas A&M team. Struggled to beat Syracuse and what was Trevor Lawrence's first start of the season. And, just had some other – I remember watching the Duke game. It ended up being 35-6, but it wasn't a real pretty win. The BC game was not a real pretty win, 27-7 over a BC team that honestly just wasn't good. That team that went 7-5 that year. I mean, they beat Temple, they beat Wake, they beat UMass, they beat Holy Cross. They weren't a very good team that year. And Clemson looked kind of sloppy doing it, but they kind of got hot down the stretch. They peaked at the right time, and that allowed them to go into the postseason and just destroy people. I mean, really. I mean, it really you started to see that. You'd see bits and pieces of that team showing their potential, but then they go out and have a blowout win over South Carolina. They destroy Pitt in the ACC title game. They beat Notre Dame convincingly in the second half, and then they just whooped Alabama. And so it's like, okay, there's moments where you're like, yeah, I don't know if this is a championship caliber football team. They're good. They're very good, but I don't know if they're championship caliber. But they just kind of got hot at the right time because they were so young. As those guys got a lot more experience, then all of a sudden their performance got a lot better. And we saw the best version of Trevor Lawrence that year was in the postseason. So, that's kind of what I mean by the parallels. And I'm not saying Notre Dame's going to win a championship because that Clemson team would have never lost to Northern Illinois. All right. I'm making the point about we've seen teams that have peaked very late in the season compared to when most championship caliber teams peak, which is usually closer towards the early part of the season to the middle of the season, right? But we've seen teams that have peaked late. Like I said, Ohio State peaked a little bit later. We saw Clemson peak a little bit later in 2018. And that's where Notre Dame hopes to be, Trevor, because the team we've seen for the first 8 games is one that's good enough to maybe make some noise in the postseason, a game or two if they get the right matchup. But I don't know that they're a team just yet that is championship caliber. How they perform. So here's what I'll kick to you, Trevor, after that long rant that I just went on. It comes down to this for me when I look at this football team. The team that we said going into the first bye that we're going to find out if this team is it is what it is, just a flawed team that just, get used to what it is, folks. It sucks and it's going to be disappointing, but it's just a team that doesn't have whatever it takes to really grow and build and play to their potential to any kind of degree. And especially on offense, we're going to find out a lot about the offense. Well, I think they checked a lot of those boxes, Trevor. Now we go into the final stretch. Okay, they showed that they can make the big jump to where this team becomes a problem for folks. Now the question coming out of the second bye is there another level? Can they take it to another level on both sides of the ball? And that's what's going to tell us are they going to be getting there into the postseason as a good team that maybe wins a game or two if they get the right draw, or are they going to be a team that people point to and say, that team right there, that's a problem. It's a lot like the 2018 Clemson team. I've told this story before. I have some friends that coach in the ACC, some people I know in the ACC. And I remember being told before the Notre Dame Clemson game that or excuse me, right after the Notre Dame Clemson game. I was told before by some people that Clemson was concerned about Notre Dame. Like, they're like, this isn't the same Notre Dame team that they've been in the past. And when they beat Notre Dame, I was told by people around the program and people in the league that Clemson felt like they had won the title already. Their view going into the postseason was, if we beat Notre Dame, we're going to win the title. That's the team that they were worried about because they watched how that team was playing down the stretch of that season. And I feel like this team can become that, to where when you're a higher seed, you're like, please don't get Notre Dame be in our draw. Please don't let Notre Dame be in our draw. You do not want them, and you do not want to be a team that's been off for 3 weeks and have to face Notre Dame team coming off of a home game where they've got a chance to get rolling the way that they've played. You do not want that. That's what Notre Dame needs to get to. And that's going to be the question in this final 4-game stretch is, can they take that jump, Trevor, and can they get to the point where they go from a really good team to a team that can truly go toe-to-toe with anybody and becomes that team that you don't want to play, like a USC in 2016, like a Clemson in 2018, like an Ohio State in 2014, where you're like, oh, crap, I really hope the committee leaves that team out, because I do not want to play that team that just destroyed Wisconsin. And please let TCU get in the playoff. Please let Baylor get in and not Ohio State. Can Notre Dame become that team? This next 4-game stretch is going to tell us if they can do that.
Yeah, one of the biggest things that sets those championship caliber teams apart is, to me, it's multifaceted. You can break it down into 2 different things, right? One hand, you have the skill. You have to have the skilled players at certain positions to make that next level jump, right? You can be a fundamentally sound, disciplined football team, but if you don't have the skill where it counts, at some point you are capped out, right? Notre Dame is a team that has shown that they have the skill at multiple positions, especially where they need it, right? The biggest thing for Notre Dame to make a jump now is consistency. That is what championship caliber teams start doing. Like Ohio State in 2014, it was a lot of this in the early part of the season. And then things started to level out and they started to beat teams and play teams more consistently. 2018 Clemson, to what you were bringing up. It was a lot of this in the first part of the season. And then when it mattered, when teams got hot, when Clemson got hot, they started playing at a more consistent level. And that's what I see with Notre Dame. With Notre Dame, it was, we were having conversations before the bye week of, can this team move the ball up and down the field at all? Not even with some level of consistency. Are they going to have to win every single game 14-10, 17-14, 13-10? And now we're starting to see flashes in this last 3-game stretch between, Stanford. You saw a little bit of it against Louisville, but specifically against Stanford, Georgia Tech, and Navy. There were a lot of flashes where Notre Dame was putting together consecutive drives and sometimes even consecutive quarters. But what I'm going to be looking for in this next 4 games is, can Notre Dame play multiple games consistently? It can't be, the offense just rattled off 21 points in the first quarter. Yeah, what they do in the second and third quarter, get 60 total yards. It can't be, they had a really bad first quarter, but they had a great second and third, And against Navy, we kind of saw that complete performance of what this team can look like against a quality ranked opponent when they do put together a 4-quarter football game. Now, instead of just stacking drives and just stacking quarters, now it's starting to stack games. You do that focusing on each drive, each quarter. But that's going to be the next step in Notre Dame's evolution, specifically on offense, of, are they going to be able to compete with those top-tier teams? Because if you go and you play in Ohio State and you play in Oregon or you play at Georgia or you play at Texas, you can't win that game by having 2 good quarters and 2 quarters where you're just a no-show, right? So that, to me, is going to be their next step in this process of, how is Notre Dame going to be able to take that next step, refine what you do? There's a lot of conversation around, well, do they have the receiving core to do it? You can make the argument that Michigan didn't have the receiving core to do it last year, and they won a national championship. Roman Wilson was a good receiver. He wasn't a world beater in comparison to, Rome Odunze and Jalen Polk at Washington, right? Or Isaiah Bond being in Alabama, right? Roman Wilson was a good wide receiver for Michigan, but I don't think he was one of the guys that on the scouting reports, like, hey, we got to keep an eye out for this guy. This is a stout, amazing, solid defense. And Blake Corum can hurt you in so many different ways. And they were able to win a championship off of that. I'm not saying the wide receivers can be a non-factor moving into the postseason. They have to be, just like Roman Wilson was a factor for the Michigan offense. But for me, big picture, high level, it's about consistency. And can you consistently be the same team through 4 games, through 4 quarters? That will put a lot of the questions at ease for me going into the postseason.
So, Trev, we're going to get into the offense part here next. But before we do, folks, just hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. I did not put this one out on Twitter today because, well, Trev, you know what I was doing right before the show started, so I didn't have time to get it out there. So, on those days when I don't put it out on Twitter and you want to know what we're doing, that's why you have to have your notifications on for your YouTube channel. And, of course, in order for it to show up in your notifications, you have to be subscribed to the channel. Plus, it helps us out when you do those things. So we greatly appreciate that.